All right. It looks like I will actually get to part 3 of my series on videos about miniature gaming and tabletop simulator. This is part the third. I'm Jim Cyrano from the Armchair Dragoons, and this episode is going to be about terrain and scale. We've already learned about some of the basics of tabletop simulator, some of the tools that I use. We've also talked a lot about the various types of miniatures you can get and how you can pace them down. But what about the terrain? One of the things we really love about miniature gaming is the terrain, and I wouldn't want to neglect it. So I really want to get started and talk about some of the terrain sets that I've built. But to do it, and the crazy thing about it is, I'm actually going to go to a set that is not Napoleonic. I know that's totally weird, and nobody likes it. But I've got some points I want to make. This is actually a set for What a Tanker, the remarkable rule set for one-on-one tank fighting offered to you by the great folks at Two Fat Lardies. This allows me to talk about a couple of things. The first thing is, if you are going to use Tabletop Simulator and you want to play miniatures on a table that is in the vicinity, well, really, anything less than 4 by 8, 8 feet by 4 feet in scale, get the Kraken table. Let me just zoom out a little bit. This is the Kraken table. It's a specially designed table setup. You can get it as a custom. It's in the workshop for free. You go get it. It's spelled just like the mythical sea beast. And it is a marvel. And it's used for all sorts of different things. But if you are a miniature tabletop gamer and you're not using the Kraken and you're playing at a scale of 8 feet by 4 feet or less, I don't know what you're doing. Not only do you get a nice area of table space inside of a nice wood grain table, but you get all these drawers on which you can put the different cool things. In addition, if I can get it to work the first time, you get these creatures that stick out from either side. These are obviously remarkable tools that'll set you right up and able to use gaming tables for your purposes. So, number 1, get the Kraken table. Number 2, let's talk about terrain. Now, you already know, and I've said it a number of times, that my wife designs my tables. That's what you're seeing back here by the way of the green grass mat. And that's well and good. She does a very fine job of it. But you might want a whole lot of other terrain, and you could see a lot. Where does it come from? Well, the truth is, there is no point in Tabletop Simulator in reinventing the wheel. This table is set up for a very specific scenario. It's actually from the first episode, the first volume of Lard magazine, Two Fat Lardies' official newspaper or magazine, called Barkman's Corner. Actually, it's called Barkman's Corner Overdrive, and it tells the famous story of a single German Panther that took on a whole lot of American tanks towards the end of the Second World War in Normandy. And this is the scenario. This is the setup as described in the board. It's on a 4x6 and all that. But I wanted to create it. And I'm going to upload this scenario so that you can go get Barkman's Corner Overdrive as played by the Armchair Dragoons, as offered by Two Fat Lardies. This is just one tabletop setup. But you're not just going to get this. But wait, there's more. What you're going to get are these bags. See them here? This is an array of terrain that I inherited. Except for this mat, which my wife did for me, I did none of this. All of these models are part of an incredible collection of 3D items of all kinds that folks have done for Tabletop Simulator. And there's a wonderful collection of them assembled right here in these bags. You're going to see this bag alone has different effects. What kind? Let's search. You can see we've got gas. We've got two types of gas, dust clouds and smoke. And they actually create some lovely effects if you put them behind the tank. We love doing this when the tank blows up. As you can see, we pull down. Oh no, now this tank is on fire. And that's incredibly sad. That tank is burning. Anyway, but this is an effect. They're cool, but they're not what we're here about. We're here to talk about terrain. We'll take a look at this. We've got here 184 terrain pieces. Let's open it up. And as you can see, it's an incredible array. Wooden fences. Let's turn that to the side so you can see it. And a lot of buildings. Buildings of big ones, little ones. sections of road, even bigger buildings. You can get them all. And as you can see as we scroll down here to the right, wall sections, bit of a lake, ruined walls if you're doing Stalingrad or something like that, or any of those sorts of battles. We've got palm trees. We've got brush. I'm going to show you a little something with that in a second. It's really, and of course, if you're going to be doing something on the Eastern Front, you've got to have trains. You've got to have train tracks and all these other crazy things. And then, of course, you've got trees. We're going to talk about all these things. So I'm going to make sure I upload to the workshop this battle set so you can have all these pieces. So they're all there. I guess I wanted to show it to you so that you would stipulate, yep, sure enough, Jim, they're all there. But let me get rid of all these now so I can talk to you about something else. We are miniature war gamers. At least I figure you are. If you've come to watch this video, you're some sort of a miniature war gamer. And so you understand the concept of scale. That whether highly abstracted or highly detailed, a certain number of inches on the tabletop is equal to a certain number of inches in real life. Well, we would like to create that as much as possible. And it's possible to do this, especially as we saw with miniatures and even with these tanks in Tabletop Simulator. In fact, I've got an entirely separate video where I talk about how I make these tanks almost exactly 1/100th scale using Tabletop Simulator. But what about the terrain? The terrain's a little bit tricky because it's got a look. It's got a feel that's as important as any aesthetic. If you're doing a Kriegspiel map, you want that to be as detailed as possible. But when you're building something like this, you're going to be making some aesthetic choices. What looks right? What feels right? How big is this house really? And I want you to all commit to me that you're going to play around with it because it should be play. And I'm going to tell you that these right here, all over the place, these are my favorite trees. There's a bunch of trees in the bags I'm going to leave for you, but these are my favorites. But you'll notice even here, I've chosen to scale them. Some are smaller, some are bigger, some are even smaller, to create a sense of variation and to create a sense of what goes on in nature. And how do you do that? As I think you're going to suspect, it couldn't be simpler. You just grab the item. Ooh, I locked these down, but good, didn't I? You're going to grab an item like a house, and you're going to make it smaller and bigger using the plus or minus keys. And that's what I do. Now, I do a few other things along these lines to sort of give me some guidance. But before I get to those, I also want to show you something about hills. Hills are one. Now, this is going to apply for trees. What I've said applies for hedges. It applies for these fields over here. All of them are sizable to your heart's content, just like the fences and all these other things. The one thing I would say about houses, and this is something to remember, is that not all of them are built the same when someone models them in the program that they're building with. Some of them are more readily usable than others. Always accept the fact that there is an invisible wire mesh box around these in the rendering engine. And as a consequence, let's see how close we can get. See that? Sooner or later, that's going to happen. That's actually pretty good. That's good and snug. Some houses out there that you're going to use, that will not work. The craziest ones are the houses that are L shapes. Those are going to give you absolute fits. But all that said, and nonetheless, that's probably the only really substantial issue I deal with houses. But that's about houses, that's about hedges, that's about fences. But I've got a particular relationship with hills. And I'm going to tell you the truth. I have never liked traditional war game hills. What do I mean? If you've played war games for any length of time, you have seen these hills. See them there? There they are. A little round one. This lozenge-shaped one, or this big oval pill-shaped, and this square. Now, absolutely, they are sizable. See how little? See how big? You can shrink them, you can size them. And if you want, you can do the standard thing we've all done over the years that goes all the way back to H.G. Wells and Grant doing this stuff. Cut it, paste it, shrink it. That's not complicated, is it? Now suddenly you've got that famous layer cake hill look. It's not complicated, right? Nothing to it. You got your layer cake hill. And as everybody will tell you, these hills are great if you're if what you want is to be able to march the miniatures up, because you can put them on the levels. There's nothing wrong with it. I understand the point. I can't stand them. I've never liked them. I don't know why, it's just me. But if you're going to use them, I'm going to give you a suggestion. These particular hills, this particular set of hills, which I use all over my sets, have one very big advantage. And I want to commend the gentleman who created them for, I guess I would say, building that advantage into the game. This right here is one of those hills. It's the round one. But what have I done with it? I have mapped over it the texture from my grasp. How'd I do that? See this? You go here to Custom, Diffuse Image, copy that, go into here, Custom, and paste it right here. And the next thing you know, this matches this, and it blends. I'll tell you, it matches so well that sometimes, unless you're down here giving it a good hard look, it's actually rather difficult to see. So I think you're doing well. And again, I understand that people like to use these. You're also going to notice over here in the bags I'm going to give you, that I'm going to leave up there, there's an entire bag of hills. And there they all are. Now these are a little rougher. I like them a little bit better than those stereotypical war game hills. They're a little odd shaped. That one got sucked away by the map awful quick. There we go. See, they got these nice odd shapes. They're a little more organic, I guess. And frankly, because they're a little rough around the edges, they look a bit more like what I'd probably wind up making if I were crafting these myself. You can absolutely do the same thing I did and map the texture of this right onto there, and it'll have a great look. We can just do one of those for the benefit of the home audience. Again, all we're doing is we're copying. And there it is. Suddenly it matches this texture. So that's how I do these hills, these extruded, contoured hills. But you know something? I've moved away from them. I just don't like the way they look. And so what have I done? Well, I've actually done a little action, and it's not me, because I can't do anything like this. I've engaged my wife, and she has started working on texturing for me. This is the Battle of Teugn-Hausen. It's a black powder. I'm back to Napoleonics. But you see what she did there? First, she gave me an underlayment for my trees. There are mats, and you're going to see them in the sets I'm going to post. There are mats you can put under your trees. They work just fine. They're very clear. I, however, like this look better. She has created for me a tree texture that she borrowed wholesale from Google Maps. She cut and pasted the image out, she tells me, and I use that to be the underlayment to demarc the outline, the limits of whatever forested area I've got. I then use my favorite tree, there they all are, and I sprinkle them around. Now, little note about trees, by the way, little tip. I lock down my terrain, and I'm going to talk about that in a second, with the exception of trees. I love to be able to just move them out of the way. All right? So I put down a few trees. I've got this. But when it comes to the contours of the hills, I love just to have her draw them in this subtle way. You see that there? It's pretty obvious where they are. It doesn't cause a lot of trouble. And I think it just looks a ton better. Your mileage may vary, and I respect it. But it's what I like. I definitely love the way she does roads. There are roads that you're going to be able to get, size them in several types that you will find in the set. But again, I ask her that she draw them. This is how she does them. She can size them at different widths depending on the needs of the rules, and she just sketches them out. And here's how she does rivers. Again, there are rivers available in the sets, but I love the way she does them just like this. I think they look great. It's entirely your call. Now let me say this. This turns us to the big conversation today that is other than these terrain pieces, and that is scaling. There's always a difficult relationship between ground scale, figure scale and height scale. What do I mean? These figures, as I think we've talked about, are not 28 millimeters tall. In scale, they're about 54 millimeters tall. These are very, very big figures. I think it's a function of the fact, as I've said, that these figures are quite tall and thin. If they weren't this big, they would look silly and kind of lost sitting on these larger black powder bases. So they're quite big, and that's the way they're generally going to come when you take a look at other figure sets for black powder and rules like it. But as a result, they're going to tower a little bit. And so when you go to build your villages, like good old Saladorf here, or let's fly all the way down here, I love doing this, all the way down here to Teugen, these houses, take a look at them in scale. Those fellas are pretty darn big in scale. I don't care. I tend to design a little bit down. You absolutely can make these houses bigger. I've shown you how to do it. But the reality is, for me, I don't like how big that looks. I think that's disproportional. Now, in black powder, these are representational buildings anyway. It's not these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 buildings are supposed to represent the entire village of Teugen. And these two over here are supposed to be Royth. They're obviously not. They're, again, representational. So it's okay to me that they're a little bit smaller. You can make them bigger, but there are consequences of that. So the scaling issue is something you should definitely think about. I want to say this because it tormented me. Let me show you where. It's in actually one of my favorite game sets, the sets that I've evolved over the years for Sharp Practice. And when I started doing Sharp Practice, and actually I suppose I should show you what I started doing at the beginning. When I started doing Sharp Practice games, I began with individual figures on actually rather small boards because I thought it would be adequate and it would save space and everything like that. And so what I got was, originally, were figures like this. See how much space they've got on there? See how relatively small they are? And even before that, I did them without bases. And you can play these games, I absolutely guarantee it, you can play these games without bases for your soldiers if you think that scale works better for you. This isn't about figures as much as it is at their physical appearance. Because let me tell you, having played it all these different ways, it doesn't matter all that much what those variations are. It's what you think is attractive and how you want to play. Let's take a look at this one. Probably the best example I can think of. See these fellas? These, relatively speaking, are little bitty dudes. No bases at all, and yet these are all perfectly workable for Sharp Practice. In fact, you can see the video where my friend Vance and I played this game in Sharp Practice, and I got my hat handed to me. So you can do it. This is a Sharp Practice set. Sharp Practice doesn't care that much about having a squared off base. But eventually, I wanted to give it a try. Oh, and as a consequence, these buildings, much smaller, roads narrower, bridges narrower, and buildings tinier. So all that worked out rather well. But as time went on, I wanted them bigger. I wanted them to stand out, and I wanted them to pop and be truer to something more like the aesthetic I was seeing online with the guys that were playing Sharp Practice. So I played with it, and played with it, and played with it, and played with it. And what I came out with is a scale like this. See how much bigger they are? Now they stand out. But the consequence is you absolutely now have to take up the size of all the buildings and the terrain and the yard and everything else like that. Some folks aren't going to like it, but I think it's more reflective of the scale and the sense of size that Sharp Practice was intended to be played at. So it's what I'm going to use. This sort of thing happens and becomes sort of a rabbit hole you can fall down if you, like me, fall in love with Tabletop Simulator, because it does give you so many absolutely wonderful possibilities. And by the way, speaking of those possibilities, it's certainly not like, as I've said, I'm only into tanks or I'm only into Napoleonics. This is an upcoming game that I'm working on for the Battle of Omdurman, the close of the wars of the modest wars of the British at the end of the 19th century. You'll notice here the hills. Now this terrain, which my wife also did for me, that terrain drawn out and mapped onto these hills, providing the hills for this end of the battlefield. Also going into those bags, I grabbed some of these little objects and just littered them around to give a sense, because otherwise this is a featureless plain. And just because I couldn't bear to be without it, I threw down a single palm tree. Whether you lock your terrain or not is going to be a hit or miss proposition. More often than not, I prefer to leave it unlocked. The reason being, maybe I want to get it out of the way. The only exception are houses and roads and rivers, if you use roads and rivers. Certainly houses. Those things notionally you don't want moving that much. But anything that's largely ornamental like this, I tend to leave unlocked just because it's frankly a little easier to deal with as I'm moving the troops about. And just a little peek. This, by the way, down here, we'll zoom in on him. This is the future Sir Winston Churchill preparing to charge with the 21st Lancers. Look at those guys. There they are. So as you can see, you can do this sort of terrain. You can do the grass. You can do rivers. I actually am very fond of this one that was drawn for me. If you've played the game Rebels and Patriots, you know that it has a series of preset scenarios. This is preset scenario C for Rebels and Patriots. Remember I told you there were underlayments for trees? Here they are, marking out the forest base very nicely. And this is a 2-spec river that my wife drew right onto this map for me. She's a skilled graphics person. It's what she does. However, even with her kit and her skill, this is a pretty rapid process. It doesn't take a lot of effort to put out this sort of quality because, truthfully, Tabletop Simulator makes it so easy to use. And here you can see, by the way, remember the candle that wasn't working before? There's the candle. But over here you can see, again, I've gone to the bigger figures. This time, because of the nature of Rebels and Patriots, I've put them on the round bases. But again, I've got the scale up high. So, big scale figs, standard scale map, it all works remarkably well. So, heading right down to very near the end of the time that I wanted to spend on this, as I've said, I've tried to keep them into a reasonable amount of time. I did want to take just one last moment to go in here and share a little bit about my thoughts on the Teugn-Hausen battlefield. And let me tell you why. Because it directly affects terrain. And this is a reality that every individual who has ever dealt with miniatures gaming knows. That's not exclusive in any way to Tabletop Simulator. I struggled for the longest time with this particular battlefield because I wanted to play it this way, such that the French were attacking up this way. It was only after going online and studying a lot of great Black Powder 2 setups that I realized that the best way to play this battle was this way, with this long, narrow fight. And so thinking about your terrain in advance, mapping it out, figuring out what you've got the space for is one thing. But then when you realize that in something like Tabletop Simulator, you're not limited to size. You don't have to worry that you don't have a space for a 12 by 6 table, which is what this is, in your basement. You've got it in this virtual space, and it's accessible for your use at any time. And I think that's really remarkable. But think about your design, think about the map you want to do, and take advantage of that. One last thing, if I can, and it's strangely enough one of the things that our group is getting best known for, at least in the limited way that folks are used to seeing our stuff. This is the game that we're going to be playing this Saturday coming up on our Saturday Night Fights. This owes a lot to the old Meldrum War Game guys. Hey guys, thanks a lot, everybody who's over there. But this right here is another way of looking at it. This is, again, a map, but this was done by the guys at Old Meldrum. This was their map, and I just downloaded it and threw it up. These are not figures, obviously, but cards they did. And I'm going to show you how to do this stuff in our last segment, which will be called Bits and Pieces, and how we do these sorts of things. So instead of figs, we have these cards, which are reversible. And of course, I threw up a few trees and a few other artifacts, but it's just another way of thinking about terrain and the fact that you don't necessarily have to do without a map. So, or you don't have to do it with a standard set of terrain. You could do it with a map and play right on it, which I like because, frankly, it feels a good deal like Kriegspiel. So there are some incredible possibilities that TTS opens up that I hope you'll explore. And as I say, please definitely think about playing with. So let's go all the way back here. I want to thank you for sticking around for this third part of miniature gaming in TTS. This has been a little squishier because there's so much to say. I didn't want to talk about any of the details of the terrain because, quite frankly, I think you'll learn the most just by experimenting with it. Know that it's all there. You can pull it out. You can make infinite copies. You can size it however you want. And if it all doesn't work out, delete it and start over. But once you get it, remember to save it. You'll thank me later. Anyway, I'm Cyrano from the Armchair Dragoons. I'm very happy you stopped by. I hope you enjoyed it. Please feel free to ask me any questions you might have. I always enjoy them. And in the meanwhile, take care and have fun.